not everyone voted. Who says yes? Any yeses? No? About a 50-50 split, okay, so some other naysayer, why not? Inquiring minds want to know. You said no, now you gotta defend your answer.
Because mammals, birds, and reptiles are all extant amphibians. No.
Well, we'll see. Okay? But certainly, as we go through different groups, it's important to stay on top of that issue, because many taxonomic groups that have great utility for allowing us to know, to identify certain groups of animals, may not necessarily be monophyletic. That doesn't mean that it's still not especially useful. Okay? So certainly you should be able to readily explain why class Amphibia is not monophyletic. And again, at the level of detail that we're going over things in lecture and on the handout, you should get a handle on some of the differences between extant and extinct amphibians. Okay? And what the heck is a Lis amphibian? Lis amphibia is what?
It's a subclass.
It is a subclass. Okay?
This is my only question. Isn't it within Sarcopterygia, but that's also a subclass?
Yes,
So
and
then how does that work?
that's because the nesting in the Linnaean system does not correspond in a simple way to phylogenetic relationships. It's just that simple. Okay, so you have some, so you don't have, so oddly enough, you can have things in the Linnaean system of equal taxonomic rank, and yet one will be nested within the other. Okay? And remember, for Sarcopterygia, the clade Sarcopterygia is different than the subclass Sarcopterygia. The subclass Sarcopterygia is lobe-finned fishes. Clade Sarcopterygia is lobe-finned fishes plus tetrapods. Okay? So what's an example of a Lis amphibian? Besides being a subclass,
The ones that, coelacanth? The ones that look like the
No.
giant earthworms?
coelacanths are not Lis amphibians. But what was the other group you were referring to? That's part of Lis amphibia.
It starts with a G.
It does, okay. The Gymnophiona. Okay. So one lineage of Lis amphibians is pretty odd, and as you say, looks quite like an earthworm, but of course it's perfectly good vertebrate. You know, has a vertebral column, all those good things. And is the only Lis amphibian, these odd limbless Gymnophiones. We've had your amphibian lab.
There's salamanders.
Salamanders, okay. So salamanders and Gymnophiona represent all, that accounts for all extant Lis amphibia. Frogs and toads, all those other ones, also known as what? A neuron, okay? All right. There are indeed some synapomorphies of less amphibians. And you should certainly always be able to think of at least one. And a lot of what we're going to go over today is what the skin is like in this extant group that is commonly used to gain insights into this transition from an aquatic existence to a more terrestrial existence. Of course, amphibians, most of them, still have great reliance on water, at least for reproduction. Okay. You've got this cladogram on your handout. So have handout 7 available for handy-dandy reference. Is Eusthenopteron an amphibian? Who says yes, raise your hands. Who says no, raise your hands. And a bunch of folks didn't vote. Let's try that again. Who says yes, raise your hands. That Eusthenopteron here is an amphibian. There's kind of a big hint on this slide. Care to reconsider? Okay. That's an osteoliform fish. So remember that that is basal to tetrapods. And all this stuff is tetrapods. And then there's a whole bunch of extinct stuff on here besides this example of an osteoliform fish. We've talked at great length about Ichthyostegalia, right? About what its skull is like, and what its appendages were like. And indeed, that is an amphibian, and that is a tetrapod. Sadly, it's extinct. Boy, it'd really be cool if these things were still wandering around, wouldn't it? The temnospondals are another extinct lineage of amphibians. The lepospondylii, yet another extinct group of amphibians. Anthracosauroidea, yet another extinct group of amphibians. And Samoromorphia. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff that's extinct. The amniote vertebrates are a clade consisting of what classes of vertebrates? Somebody give me one class of amniotes. Mammals, okay. 2 to go.
Maybe.
Pardon?
Reptiles.
Reptilia. Somebody else? Another one?
Apes.
Apes. Okay. So that's a big chunk of stuff that all belongs here. But notice all these extinct things are amphibians. These extinct things are amphibians. And these are extant taxa belonging to the subclass Lysamphibia. Okay? So unlike the entire class Amphibia, that is not monophyletic. Lysamphibia, which includes all extant amphibians, is monophyletic. So it's pretty easy to get tripped up because of this difference between the extinct and extant amphibians. And I imagine you're most familiar by far with the extant amphibians. So we've got a really deep split in here in things that are included as amphibians. And there's yet another term kicking around for a bunch of these extinct amphibians. They're referred, many of them belong to a group called the labyrinthodont amphibians. And that includes Ichthyostegalia, that includes the temnospondals, And that includes this stuff. So we have yet another name that in no way, shape, or form represents a monophyletic group. Nonetheless, when you read about extinct amphibians, you'll commonly bump into this term of a labyrinthidon amphibian. Okay? And on your handout, you have not an exhaustive list, but a list of some of the synapomorphies for these different groups. So you should be well versed not only at drawing cladograms to summarize these relationships, but mapping some traits onto those cladograms. And again, we're not always going to have handy dandy traits that we can map onto every single internode. For obvious reasons, I'm emphasizing things that you can see, anatomical traits, so as supporting evidence for these phylogenetic relationships. Okay? And you've got a lot of nice figures in your book of these taxa. Okay? So let's go back to our friend Ichthyostega as an example of an early labyrinthodon amphibian. And here is a section through the tooth of said beast. And if you look at all these convoluted mineralized areas, they form a maze-like pattern, a labyrinth-like pattern, which is actually the underlying reason for this name. Dont refers to tooth. So you have a tooth with a labyrinth structure. So that's sort of the origin of that name. Okay. But as I emphasized, this pops up in a bunch of places. So the Labyrinthodontia is not a clade. It's actually a polyphyletic group, not even just a paraphyletic group. Okay. And some of the key features of interest, in part for this transition from water to land, is that based on how these bones fit together, these beasts had an elbow that could be bent back and forth, flexed and extended. And as we mentioned before, rather large ribs, and furthermore ribs that have these rather odd overlapping processes. And within the vertebral column, there are zygapophyses. So you're aware that sort of the round part of the vertebra below the dorsal hollow nerve cord is referred to as the centrum. And in a lot of fishes, it kind of looks like the spool that thread would be wound around, okay, fairly cylindrical kind of round. And that provides important articulating surfaces for the vertebra. But in addition to having those articulations at either end of the centra, these zygapophyses are sort of shelf-like projections. So the vertebra of tetrapods have much more complex shapes on average than those of fishes, and additional processes that are believed to restrict the movement in certain directions. And perhaps play an important role for supporting the vertebral column and the weight of the animal when the animal is out of water. Okay? Temnospondyls are yet another extinct group of amphibians, and they're of interest in part because they belong to the same lineage that gave rise to all extant amphibians, namely the subclass Lissamphibia. And here's a reconstruction of one. Can you see anything on here that reminds you of what you can see in some major orders of Lissamphibia? Somebody on this side of the room?
Five toes on hind limbs.
Okay, a whole bunch of tetrapods have that. Be more forward thinking. So we want something that differentiates this group from other amphibians. Did you figure it out?
No.
Would it be like the coastal birds?
That's not what I'm thinking of. He referred to how many toes on the hind limbs. And I said, be more forward thinking than that.
Four toes on the four limbs.
Here we go, okay. And you've seen this in what two orders of bliss amphibians in lab? You've seen 3 orders of bliss amphibians in lab.
It's Urodilla and Anura.
Okay, Anura, and what was the other one?
Urodilla.
Right, okay. And common name, someone else for Urodele on this side of the room? Salamanders, newts, all that stuff. On this side of the room for Anura, common name, frogs and toads. Okay. The common name of toad is essentially meaningless, as you may have discovered. I mean, in lab, you've seen American toads. Those are in the family Bufonidae, but then there are spadefoot toads that belong to a different family, Scampiopidae, and there are narrow-mouthed toads that belong to Microhylidae. So unfortunately, the common names are a bit of a mess. A lot of times people say, oh, what's the difference between a frog and a toad? And not much. If you include everything that's called a toad, usually when people ask that question, they're talking about what's the difference between a frog and a member of the family Bufonidae. Okay, and that is more readily dealt with. Okay, yeah, so 4 toads on it, very different than our hands. That's a derived condition because their most recent common ancestor had more than that. Okay, and it's a good bet based on the shape of these things and where they've been found that they're pretty highly aquatic. Notice how the eyes are somewhat dorsally bended. To me, it sort of looks like someone, just stepped on a salamander, or maybe like in the cartoons, ran over a salamander with a steamroller, and then this is kind of what resulted. So they've got quite a flat skull compared to some other groups. And as we recognize, only 4 digits on the forefeet, although the hind feet retain 5. Okay. Yet another group of extinct amphibians are anthracosaurs. You have a figure of one, 10.10b in your textbook. If I were to look at this, and this is not a photograph, this is just an artist's rendition. Would your first guess be that that's an amphibian? What does that remind you of? It looks a heck of a lot like a lizard. Of course, lizards are reptiles. Reptiles are amniotes. Amniotes are not within the class Amphibia. But these are some of the extinct amphibians that are sometimes referred to as reptilomorphs because they are reptile-like in their appearance. And far from having a flattened skull, they have much more of a dome-shaped skull and therefore laterally oriented eyes. They have retained some craniokinesis, which is actually retaining a very old trait. That's not the synapomorphy, that's a symplesiomorphy. Of course, fishes have highly kinetic skulls. And unlike bliss amphibians, they have 5 digits on the fore and behind feet. And the piece de resistance, I'll be darned, these little buggers actually have claws, okay? Now, some of you may have heard of African clawed frogs. African clawed frogs don't really have genuine claws. African clawed frogs simply have a lot of keratin on the tips of their digits. And keratin, that's the same stuff that's in our fingernails. It's a rather hard protein. And that horny-like covering of the toes superficially resembles a claw. But a true claw will actually have a bony core beneath a horny covering, okay? Okay, if we kind of return to, yes,
I was gonna ask, so are all of these like the extinct groups on handout four, not four, handout 7, sorry. Are they just counted as amphibians, or are they like intermediate forms?
they are still within class Amphibia.
Okay, so even though it's like between like list amphibia and amniota, like even though they're in between,
They're still
just
class Amphibia. Yeah, so that last example, even though that is a reptile-like beast, it is an amphibian. It is, and in the sense that it belongs to class Amphibia. Okay? And it is not an amniote. And all reptiles are amniotes. Okay? Some key traits for Lis amphibia, some of which you've seen in the lab. I think the easiest one to remember is pedicellate teeth. These are teeth that sort of have two parts, and in lab, I think they're most easily seen in the large bullfrog skeletons, okay? So pedicellate teeth have a conical base that kind of looks like a volcano, okay? And then sitting atop that is sort of a cap. And then there's connective tissue that attaches these two parts in the teeth. So even though it's hard to discern the two parts in a big bullfrog skull, you can usually see, because of shrinkage, an indentation that forms a ring around that cap of the pedicellate tooth. So if you didn't get a good look at that last time, bug Olivia to bring out that bullfrog skeleton again so you can take another look at it. There are a number of things regarding the skull bones in Lis amphibia that are rather similar. And I mean, a lot of those similarities are actually based on what's been lost. Again, when you look at a frog skull, to my eye, it looks like there's more space than bone in there, okay, because of the great big orbits and so on. And then another synapomorphy is a sensory structure. The papilla amphibiorum is receptive to a particular range of frequencies. So that's involved in hearing. And then another thing that characterizes the Lis amphibia is that they have skin with both granular and mucus glands, okay? So let's go into a little more detail about those glands and actually even some other glands that are found in the skin of extant amphibians. Okay? Mucus glands pretty much secrete stuff all the time. So, and it's not like they need some kind of cue in order to secrete mucus. They're just kind of humming along in the background. And the mucus serves an important function for sort of helping to entrap some water on the surface of the skin and therefore keep the skin moist. Okay? Granular glands, by contrast, only secrete after getting some cue that might be from a hormone, a humoral cue, that is circulating through the body fluids, or that can be from stimulating the nervous system, in particular the sympathetic part of the nervous system. And a variety of poisons are generated by these granular glands that are pictured in your book. And some of these things really pack a punch. One of the best known groups for having highly toxic secretions are the neotropical frogs, the so-called poison arrow or poison dart frogs belonging to the family Dendrobatidae. And as your book mentions, they have a wide variety of alkaloid toxins. And boy, some of these, I mean, they really have a lot. I mean, a lot of these Dendrobatid frogs are maybe only about an inch long or so. And I remember there was great excitement when a new species of these was discovered in Colombia with the wonderful name, belonged to the genus Dendrobates, but then the full name was Dendrobates terribilis. And so called because its toxins really packed the punch. With a lot of these Dendrobatids, if you pick them up by hand, as long as you don't have any cuts in your hand, so that the toxins can get into your circulatory system, you're in good shape. However, you'd be very ill-advised to pop one of these in your mouth where you have all your various mucous membranes and more permeable surfaces. And that Dendrobates terribilis that I mentioned is just one of many species used by the native inhabitants of Central and South America to provide poison on the tips of darts that are used with blowguns or in some cases arrows. And Dendrobates terribilis actually has enough toxins to kill 10 to 12 adult humans. So we're talking about nasty stuff. And unlike many of the other poison arrow frogs, if you actually touch one of those, you may have a bit of a reaction. So one of the ways that the Native Americans would use them is simply rub the dart against the frog. So a lot of the early specimens that were caught had scars on their back because they'd been used to provide the toxin for blowgun darts. Pretty cool little critters. When something is poisonous and colored like that, that's an example of what?
Isn't this aposematic?
That's aposematic coloration, or so-called warning coloration. And if ever there were a splashy looking group of frogs, various reds, yellows, blues, greens, with contrasting patterns of black, very bold patterns, they're often very easy to see. And presumably then, by being conspicuous, predators can learn to avoid them. Okay. There's a lot of variation in how closely packed the glands are, the proportions of different types of glands, and also how keratinized the skin of different groups of amphibians are. So amphibians are diverse, so it's important to not just think of them all as being identical, especially as far as the skin goes, because there's a tremendous amount of variation. And in some places where you sort of have a bunch of these glands packed in close proximity, glands that otherwise would only be visible microscopically become visible macroscopically to the unaided eye. And you've seen some examples of these in the lab. Can you think of a conspicuous gland that you saw in the lab that was useful for identifying different neurons?
tympanum?
The tympanum is the eardrum, but it's right near the tympanum. Someone on this side of the room?
Sounds like parotid or something, right?
Yep. So that's probably the best example of a so-called macro gland. And it's very conspicuous in toads belonging to the family Buphonidae. And the toad on the right is the infamous marine toad. I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but sadly, this toad, native to Central and South America, was pretty much introduced around the world wherever sugarcane was grown. And the motive was great, as a biological control agent to try to keep sugarcane beetles in check. But the problem is these damn things grow big. So a big female marine toad may be about a foot long and weigh a couple of pounds. And on top of that, they have these huge parotid glands. And on top of that, the bufotoxin secreted by these glands really packs a punch. So, almost any place they've been introduced, they have no natural predators. They're completely impalatable. And again, to sort of provide a frame of reference, I remember when I was down in Florida as a graduate student, where there was an introduced population of these, and I wanted to collect some for a physiology class. And instead of going out into the wilds, we actually went to a residential neighborhood near Tampa Bay Shopping Center. They do very well. A lot of invasive species actually do very well in disturbed habitats rather than native habitats. And because it's easiest to collect at night, we go around knocking on the houses to sort of give people in the neighborhood a heads up. No, we're not trying to rob you. We're looking for toads. And what was such a pleasant surprise is we were welcomed with open arms because a whole bunch of these homeowners had tried to get rid of these. And the one story that comes to mind, this one person said, yeah, you know, after I filled up a 35-gallon garbage can with these, I gave up trying to get rid of them. So their densities can be incredible. And that's enough bufotoxin that many of these folks had dogs, sizable dogs, that either became violently ill or were actually killed by attempting to eat a marine toad. It's not uncommon because people put their dog food outside and the dog food attracts flies. And not only do the marine toads eat the insects, but they'll actually eat dog food, which is really weird for an neuron. So they really pack a punch, is kind of the bottom line. So much for that digression. But a big problem is when non-native species get introduced and they don't have any biological checks on the numbers. One that may not have struck you is quite so spectacular as the parotid gland and the marine toad are actually those dorsolateral ridges that are handy for telling different species of North American rana, or now referred to also as lithobates, apart from each other. The leopard frogs have a very pronounced dorsolateral ridge, and that's actually a concentration of glands. Okay. The skin of amphibians is commonly quite permeable. Precisely how permeable it is does depend a lot on the species, and it also depends on exactly what all gets secreted. So some of the things that can pass through the skin, of course, are water, ions, and gases, okay? And exactly how they can get through, again, sort of depends on some of the gory details. And there's kind of an upside and a downside to having a permeable skin, right? I mean, if you can actually absorb oxygen through a permeable skin, well, that's kind of handy, right? Because then you need not be entirely reliant on a lung for gas exchange. But that skin has to be kept moist, so there are various problems with water loss. If you have wet skin in dry air, of course, evaporation is quite a problem. And interestingly, there's one group of frogs, quite spectacularly, that evolved a different type of gland. Lipid glands can be found in the phyllomeducine hylet frogs. You know, the hylet frogs are tree frogs. So this is a neotropical group of frogs that can be found in trees. And this particular subfamily has lipid glands, and you're well aware that lipid and water are not best of friends, okay? Fat and water do not mix at all well. So if you have a lipid coat, you basically have a raincoat, okay? Or depending on your point of view, you've got something, it's that double-edged sword. You're gonna prevent water from going out, but simultaneously that would prevent water from going in. But interestingly, these lipid glands and phyllomeducines are not distributed uniformly around the skin. So you've got a little bit of a problem of, how is the whole critter going to get this secretion on the skin in order to reduce water loss? And these frogs are quite popular in the pet trade too, for obvious reasons. Well, at least I think they're cute.
At the beginning of the dry season, we take steps to make sure that
They all have vertically elliptic pupils. And many of them are bright green and reflect ultraviolet.
all those odd places that the best of us find a little tricky. The dry season can last for
That's
weeks.
some crazy
So
joys.
it's best
Yeah,
to get the cover.
Does it say it's playing on sunscreen?
precisely, yeah.
It's hot.
Get ready for a day at the beach, smearing all that slimy stuff on. Yeah, I hate Dickies sunscreens. But in this case, that serves a very important function. These frogs are commonly way up in the canopy, and exposed to the sun more and so on, where water loss becomes more of a problem. Okay? So that is a derived behavior that's actually associated with a derived anatomy of having these lipid glands that secrete the substance that's then spread all over the skin to reduce water loss. It does not eliminate water loss, but it greatly reduces water loss. Another thing that pops up on skin that we'll talk about much more, I'll provide more examples when we get into reproduction, is nuptial pads. You probably saw some of those on some of the specimens of toads, some of the bufonids, and they're often very dark brown in appearance, if not black. And in a bunch of anurans, they're found seasonally in the males, commonly on the medial side of the first digit. How many of you, when you were kids, or even recently, have tried to grab a frog? Is it easy or hard? They're slippery suckers, aren't they, okay? Well, when frogs reproduce, males grab the females, and those nuptial pads help them grasp the slippery females, okay? Now, in addition to a localized keratinization of skin, where those nuptial pads are, you can see varying degrees of keratinization. Keratin, in the grand scheme of things, it reduces permeability to water. So some species that tend to be more terrestrial, such as many of the bufonids, have more keratin in the skin and not just limited to those nuptial pads. I don't know if some of you have ever seen a toad shed its skin, but they actually do, okay? And commonly, it's consumed, but sometimes you'll find this odd little ghost of a toad, which is the shed skin, and it's water that we keep toads pets, okay? Another specialization that has popped up in neuron amphibians are toe pads. Let's see some examples. Here's a hyalid, that's actually a barking tree frog from the southeast US. You can see these discs or pads at the tips of the toes. I love these little guys. They're commonly called glass frogs for obvious reasons. Many of them have transparent skin. Tiny little dudes, okay, very pretty. And a good number of them actually have green bones as well, so that's something kind of cool. So these are the neotropical centralita frogs, another type of frog that's commonly up in trees. There's a very diverse family, the Eleutherodactylidae. These are neotropical frogs, many of which are actually down in the leaf litter, some of which can also be found up in trees. This is an African group of frogs, the hyperoliids. Sometimes these are called reed frogs. And they're little guys, a lot of them are only about an inch long, tiny little things, kind of remind me of spring keepers. They're the toe pads. There are the Southeast Asian tree frogs, it's mostly Southeast Asian, belonging to the family Orcoclidae. And actually, the rhynid frogs are much more diverse in Southeast Asia than in the Western Hemisphere. And many rhynids in Southeast Asia have also evolved toe pads. Well, in light of the phylogeny you have for neuron families on your handout, what is a statement you think would be fair to make regarding the evolutionary origin of toe pads in neurons?
Didn't you say a lot of these are found in trees?
Yes? But you don't even need to know where they're found. If you look at your phylogeny, this is an example of what type of evolution? Convergent evolution. Okay. You look at your phylogeny, these families, and this is actually not an exhaustive list. There are even some bufonids that have toe pads, some Southeast Asian bufonids. An example that comes to mind is Peter. Okay? That's all over the place in your phylogeny. And some of the sister taxa, and actually just within this family, the rhonids, not all rhonids have toe pads. So you've got multiple independent origins of something that serves a similar function. And what is that function?
Help climb,
Pardon me?
help climbing,
It could be,
grip.
yeah, sticking on to things, adhering to things. Okay. And there's some contentious literature actually for the details of what the mechanism is of sticking. I think the current consensus is that actually it involves wet adhesion. But there are some scanning electron micrographs that indicate these toe pads commonly have a whole bunch of little structures within them rather than just being a smooth surface. So that might be involved as well. Okay. Aren't frogs looks cool looking. This, I must admit, pardon another digression. This is, well, when we talk about locomotion, we'll come back to this Southeast Asian gliding tree frog. And this is Rhacopterus nigropalmatus, found in around Malaysia and Indonesia. And females get a snout vent length about that long. So I remember when I had one for a pet, her hind foot could be on my wrist when she had a hand on my elbow. She was so big. Really spectacular. Look at all that webbing between the toes. Okay? Yet, another type of gland that can be found is widespread in plecodontic salamanders, and that is found in males. That is the hedonic gland. We've got an illustration of that, page 189 in your book. And interestingly enough, this gland secretes pheromones. And those pheromones get absorbed in the skin of the female when the male makes contact with the female. And that helps get the female receptive to mating with a particular male. And then you get some really odd stuff going on. I mean, about everything about Sicilians is weird, but oddly enough, they actually have a unique type of scale in their skin. And here's an example of one. This scale bar is just a half a millimeter, so these are really tiny and actually very difficult to see, and are found in some Sicilians. And boy, that can be cause for a little bit of confusion regarding whether that's a symplegomorphy or a synaptomorphy. Okay? So once again, for extant amphibians, how many orders are there? 3. And they are Anura, Uradella, Pinocchiona, okay? And which 2 of those 3 comprise a monophyletic group? Okay, very good. What does Ura or Euro refer to? Again, it really helps remembering this stuff if you look up some of these root words. What does the prefix A mean? Without. What's the big difference? What's the common name for these? Frogs and toads. These? What's the conspicuous difference between these and these? Oh! So, Euro, tail. You've got with a tail, without a tail. And both of those 2 groups that have that root word are in the same clade. And then the sister group to them within the Lys amphibia are the Pinocchiona. Okay. Not all orders of amphibians are created equal. There's a tremendous disparity in the number of extant species in this group. So that emphasizes yet again, if you think about the information conveyed in Linnaean taxonomic groups, just because something is a similar Linnaean taxonomic rank doesn't mean it's going to have roughly the same number of species. So far and away, the most diverse extant amphibians are anurans, and have several hundred species of salamanders and newts. The Sicilians, also known as the Genopionans, are not terribly well studied. They're burrowing and tropical, but maybe there's something on the order of 200, perhaps 300 species. Probably a lot more species are going to be discovered. Next time around, we're going to consider some key aspects of the locomotion of these different groups of amphibians with a particular eye towards gaining insights into the locomotion of the ancestral tetrapod. So make sure you keep up on looking ahead at your handouts and reading so your brain is primed for that material. Okay. Have a good weekend, and I will see you again Monday.